The biggest mistake Ethan Parker ever made wasn't calling his ex-wife a gold digger. It was saying it in a room full of people who had no idea who she really was. The 23rd floor of Parker and Wren Financial overlooked downtown Chicago through walls of glass that turned the late afternoon sunlight into sheets of gold. Below, traffic crawled through the city like streams of red and white lights, while inside the office everything felt polished, controlled, and expensive. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the open workspace. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. Conversations blended into the low hum of ambition. Claire Bennett sat quietly at her desk near the far end of the operations department, reviewing quarterly reports nobody else wanted to touch. She preferred it that way. Invisible was easier. Invisible was safe. 2 years earlier, she had been Claire Parker, Ethan Parker's wife. Back then she had attended charity dinners, company celebrations, and endless networking events where everyone seemed more interested in status than sincerity. She had spent years smiling politely beside a man who measured human worth by job titles, salaries, and last names. Then came the divorce. Quick, public, humiliating. Ethan had controlled the narrative from the beginning. According to him, Claire had only married him because he was destined for success. According to him, she wanted his money, his connections, his future. The story spread because people found it easier to believe than the truth. The truth was far less entertaining. Claire had walked away from the marriage with little more than her dignity. Ethan had kept the house, the social circle, the reputation, and somehow, even after everything, they ended up working in the same company again when Claire accepted a mid-level operations role 18 months earlier. She needed the paycheck. Ethan needed the audience. Claire. The sound of her name snapped her back to the present. She looked up. Ethan stood beside her desk, perfectly tailored navy suit, expensive watch glinting beneath the office lights. At 36, he had mastered the appearance of success. The confident smile, the firm handshake, the carefully rehearsed charm. Several employees nearby immediately became interested in whatever conversation was about to happen. Claire already knew why. Ethan never approached her privately. There was always an audience. "I heard you volunteered for the CEO Transition Committee," he said. Claire nodded. Someone had to organize the logistics. Ethan laughed softly. Still trying to get noticed by management? A few co-workers exchanged glances. Claire returned her attention to the report. "Just doing my job." "Of course." His smile widened. "That's what you always said." The words sounded harmless enough, but she recognized the familiar undertone. The subtle invitation for others to laugh with him. The reminder that he could still shape how people saw her. Claire remained silent. Ethan leaned casually against her desk. "You know, the new CEO starts next week." "I'm aware. Big opportunity for people looking to improve their situation." One of the analysts nearby chuckled. Ethan looked pleased. "Then again, you've always been good at spotting opportunities." More laughter. Small. Nervous. The kind people offered when they wanted to stay on the right side of power. Claire felt her fingers tighten around her pen. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough to feel the pressure in her knuckles. The office lights reflected softly across the polished desktop. She focused on that reflection instead of the faces watching her. "Is there something you need, Ethan?" she asked calmly. "Actually, no." He straightened. "Just checking in." Then he lowered his voice slightly, making sure everyone could still hear. "Wouldn't want anyone thinking you're trying to marry your way into another promotion." The room erupted in awkward laughter. Not because the joke was funny, because nobody wanted to be the person who didn't laugh. Claire looked at him for a long moment. His expression carried the same smug certainty she remembered from the final months of their marriage. The certainty that he controlled the room, that he controlled the story, that he controlled her. Then she smiled politely. "Have a good afternoon, Ethan." For a brief second, disappointment flickered across his face. He wanted anger. He wanted tears. He wanted a reaction. Instead, he got nothing. Ethan pushed away from the desk and walked off. The crowd slowly returned to work. Conversations resumed. Keyboards clicked again. But Claire could still feel the weight of their assumptions hanging in the air. Gold digger. Opportunist. Ex-wife. Labels were easier than truth. Later that evening, long after most employees had gone home, Claire remained in the office helping prepare materials for the upcoming executive welcome event. The company had spent months searching for a replacement after the previous CEO announced his retirement. Rumors circulated daily. Some claimed the new leader had built billion-dollar companies. Others said he rarely gave interviews and avoided publicity whenever possible. Nobody seemed to know much about him. Claire paused as a notification appeared on her phone. Her eyes settled on the message. Just 6 words. "See you next week, sweetheart." Dad. Her heartbeat stumbled. She stared at the screen while the city lights shimmered beyond the windows. 12 years. 12 years since she had walked away from the Bennett family name. 12 years since she stopped answering calls. 12 years since she decided she wanted to build a life without the weight of privilege following her everywhere. Slowly, she locked the phone and slipped it back into her purse. Across the empty office, a television mounted near the reception desk displayed a financial news segment. A photograph appeared on the screen for only a moment before changing to another story. Most people would never have noticed it. Claire did. Richard Bennett. Silver-haired. Sharp-eyed. One of the most respected executives in American finance. Her father, the man nobody at Parker and Wren knew, was about to become their new CEO. Claire looked back toward the darkening skyline. Somewhere below, thousands of lights stretched across Chicago. Thousands of stories unfolding at once. And in 7 days, one story would change forever. Ethan thought he knew exactly who Claire Bennett was. The problem was that he only knew the version she had allowed him to see. The following Monday arrived beneath a gray Chicago sky that seemed to press against the glass towers downtown. By 7:30 in the morning, the headquarters of Parker and Wren Financial was already alive with anticipation. Fresh floral arrangements lined the lobby. Catering staff moved quietly between conference rooms carrying trays of pastries and coffee. Every television screen displayed the same company welcome message beneath a polished photograph of the incoming chief executive officer. Employees gathered in clusters, exchanging rumors and predictions while pretending to focus on work. Excitement traveled through the building like electricity. Claire Bennett stepped out of the elevator carrying a tablet and a folder filled with schedules for the executive transition event. She wore a simple navy dress beneath a tailored blazer, professional enough to blend into the background. That had always been her goal. Blend in. Stay unnoticed. Yet this morning felt different. Her stomach tightened with every step she took across the marble lobby. 12 years was a long time to stay away from someone. 12 years was also a long time to carry unresolved conversations. The elevator doors opened again behind her. Ethan emerged laughing with 2 department managers. His confidence seemed even larger than usual. Promotion rumors had surrounded him for months. Most people believed the new leadership would reward high performers, and Ethan had spent weeks making sure everyone remembered his achievements. "Big day," one manager said. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks and smiled. "For some people, yes." His eyes landed briefly on Claire. "Others are just here to watch." The men laughed politely. Claire continued walking. She had become skilled at ignoring him. Not because his words no longer hurt, but because she understood something he did not. Every insult revealed more about him than it did about her. By mid-morning, the entire executive floor buzzed with activity. The formal welcome reception would begin in less than 2 hours. Employees selected to attend filled the ballroom-sized conference space overlooking Lake Michigan. Crystal chandeliers reflected against floor-to-ceiling windows. White linen covered dozens of round tables. Company banners stood beside a stage where the new chief executive officer would soon deliver his first address. Claire moved between tables checking seating assignments and presentation schedules. She kept her focus on the details. Details were easier than emotions. "You missed a spot." The voice startled her. She turned and found Sophia Reynolds standing beside her. Sophia worked in compliance and was one of the few people who had always treated Claire with genuine kindness. "What?" Claire asked. Sophia smiled. "You are staring at that stage like it owes you money." Claire laughed softly. "Just making sure everything is ready." "Sure." Sophia lowered her voice. "You look nervous." Claire glanced toward the windows. Beyond the glass, the lake stretched beneath the cloudy horizon. "Maybe everyone is nervous today." Sophia studied her face for a moment, but let the subject drop. Across the room, Ethan stood near several senior managers discussing company strategy. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the entrance. He looked like a man preparing for an opportunity he believed he deserved. Around noon, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations quieted. Heads turned toward the ballroom entrance. Security personnel appeared first. Then several board members entered. The room gradually fell silent. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. The moment she had spent years avoiding was finally arriving. A tall, silver-haired man stepped through the doorway, surrounded by executives. Richard Bennett looked almost exactly as she remembered. Time had added lines around his eyes and streaks of gray through his hair, but his presence remained unchanged. He carried himself with calm authority, the kind that never needed to announce itself. The room immediately straightened. Conversation stopped. Even Ethan's confident smile faded into professional attentiveness. Richard greeted board members and senior leaders while photographers captured the occasion. He shook hands, exchanged brief words, smiled politely. To everyone else, he was the new chief executive officer. To Claire, he was still the father whose last voicemail she had never returned. She watched from across the room, hoping distance would steady her emotions. It did not. Memories surfaced without warning. Family dinners in Boston, summer weekends on Cape Cod, long conversations about responsibility and integrity. Then came the argument that changed everything. Claire had wanted a life built on her own accomplishments. Richard had wanted to protect her from mistakes. Both had been stubborn. Neither had known how much the silence afterward would cost. A burst of applause pulled her back to the present. Richard had reached the stage. The chairman of the board delivered a formal introduction, praising decades of leadership and innovation. Employees listened carefully. Ethan stood near the front row, shoulders squared, wearing the expression of a man expecting his future to improve. Claire remained near the back, beside a service entrance. Safer there, less visible. Richard stepped to the podium. The room fell completely silent. His voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. He thanked the board, thanked the employees, spoke about trust, culture, and long-term vision. The audience responded warmly. Then something unexpected happened. Richard paused mid-sentence. His eyes moved slowly across the room, searching, looking beyond department heads and executives, beyond vice presidents and directors. Claire felt her breath catch. The room noticed the pause. Confused glances spread between tables. Richard continued scanning the crowd. Then his gaze stopped, directly on her. For a moment, neither moved. 12 years of distance seemed to disappear beneath the ballroom lights. Claire saw something in his expression she had not expected. Not disappointment, not anger. Relief. Genuine relief. Richard smiled softly. It lasted only a second before he returned his attention to the audience. Most people never noticed. Claire did. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Across the room, Ethan followed the direction of Richard's gaze. His eyes settled on Claire. A slight frown appeared on his face. For the first time all day, uncertainty entered his expression. He did not understand why the new chief executive officer had looked directly at his ex-wife. And what Ethan Parker did not know was that the answer to that question was about to change everything. The silence that followed Richard Bennett's pause lasted only a few seconds, yet for Claire it felt much longer. Around her, employees shifted in their seats and exchanged curious glances before returning their attention to the stage. Richard resumed his remarks as if nothing unusual had happened, speaking about leadership, accountability, and the future of the company. His voice remained steady and confident, but Claire could still feel the memory of that brief moment when his eyes had found hers across the crowded ballroom. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. When the speech ended, applause filled the room. Hundreds of hands came together beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Richard smiled politely and thanked everyone before stepping away from the podium. Immediately, executives and department heads began gathering near the stage, eager to introduce themselves to the new chief executive officer. The atmosphere shifted from formal presentation to professional networking. Claire quietly collected her tablet and prepared to leave. That was the plan. Finish her responsibilities. Return to her desk. Avoid unnecessary attention. Unfortunately, plans rarely survived reality. Leaving already? Ethan's voice appeared beside her before she reached the ballroom exit. Claire stopped. He stood holding a glass of sparkling water, looking unusually pleased with himself. The event is still going, she replied. I have work to finish. Ethan glanced toward the crowd surrounding Richard. Interesting timing. Claire said nothing. Ethan lowered his voice slightly. You know, I noticed something during the speech. His smile widened. The new chief executive officer seemed very interested in your corner of the room. Claire felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. Maybe he was looking at someone else. Ethan laughed softly. Sure. He studied her face carefully. Although if I did not know better, I would think you were already trying to get his attention. There it was again. The same accusation disguised as humor. The same story he had repeated for years. Around them, several employees pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Claire tightened her grip on the tablet. Not everything is about status, Ethan. That is easy to say now. His eyes drifted toward the executives near the stage. Some opportunities are worth chasing. He smiled as though he had delivered something clever. Then he walked away toward a group of managers waiting near the refreshments. Claire released a slow breath. Even after all this time, he still believed everyone operated according to his rules. Ambition, advantage, calculation. He could not imagine another way of seeing the world. Near the stage, Richard continued greeting employees. Board members introduced department leaders one by one. Claire watched from a distance. Every instinct told her to leave before anyone noticed her. Then she saw Richard glance across the room again. This time there was no uncertainty, no searching. He knew exactly where she was standing. Their eyes met briefly. Richard excused himself from a conversation. Claire's stomach dropped. No, not here. Not now. She turned toward the exit. Claire. The sound stopped her immediately. It was the first time she had heard her father's voice directed at her in more than a decade. Warm, familiar, unmistakable. The room around her seemed to fade into the background. Slowly, she turned. Richard stood only a few feet away. Several executives had followed him. Others nearby paused their conversations. Curiosity spread quickly. Richard smiled gently. Hello, sweetheart. The words landed harder than she expected. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. 12 years vanished in an instant. For a moment, she was not standing in a corporate ballroom. She was 22 years old again, arguing with her father about independence, convinced she had all the answers. Hello, Dad, she said quietly. The silence around them deepened. One executive blinked. Another looked visibly confused. Several employees exchanged startled glances. The word had reached them all. Dad. Ethan happened to turn at exactly that moment. Claire saw the smile disappear from his face. He stared across the room as if he had misheard something. Richard stepped closer. You look well. Claire laughed softly. So do you. I was hoping you would come. I work here. That is not what I meant. For the first time, genuine emotion appeared in Richard's eyes. Regret, affection, relief. The expressions were impossible to fake. Around them, whispers began spreading through the ballroom. One employee quietly repeated Claire's last name. Another looked from her to Richard and back again. Pieces were beginning to connect. Ethan remained frozen where he stood. Claire could practically see the confusion building behind his eyes. Richard glanced toward the crowd and smiled. I think we have surprised a few people. Claire followed his gaze. Dozens of faces stared back. Executives, managers, analysts, employees who had passed her desk every day without knowing anything about her life. Richard offered his arm. Walk with me. Claire hesitated only briefly before nodding. Together, they moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, while conversations erupted behind them. Nobody could hear what they said next, but everyone could see it. The new chief executive officer speaking warmly with an employee. Not as a superior, not as a colleague, as family. Ethan watched the entire thing unfold. The certainty that had always surrounded him seemed to crack for the first time. He had spent years telling everyone who Claire was, years defining her story, years assuming he understood exactly what motivated her. Yet standing there beneath the ballroom lights, he suddenly realized something deeply unsettling. He had never known her at all, and before the day was over, that realization would become impossible to ignore. The ballroom remained alive with conversation long after Richard and Claire stepped away from the crowd. The initial shock had spread through the room like a ripple across still water. Every whispered conversation seemed to circle back to the same discovery. Claire Bennett was not simply another employee. She was Richard Bennett's daughter. People who had barely noticed her before suddenly remembered every interaction they had ever had with her. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked fascinated. A few looked nervous. Claire stood beside one of the large windows overlooking Lake Michigan while Richard accepted congratulations from board members nearby. The afternoon sunlight had begun to fade, painting the water in shades of silver and blue. For the first time all day, she allowed herself a slow breath. You handled that better than I would have. Sophia Reynolds appeared beside her carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. Claire accepted one with a grateful smile. Handled what? Sophia laughed softly. The fact that half the company is staring at you like you just stepped out of a movie. Claire glanced around the ballroom. Sophia was not wrong. People were trying very hard not to look directly at her, which only made their curiosity more obvious. I never wanted attention, Claire said. That might be difficult now. Sophia lowered her voice. Did anyone know? Claire shook her head. Very few people. Not even Ethan? The question hung in the air. Claire looked down at the glass in her hand. Tiny bubbles rose silently to the surface. No, she said. Especially not Ethan. Across the room, Ethan stood with several managers near the refreshment tables. His usual confidence seemed noticeably diminished. Every few minutes his gaze drifted toward Claire and Richard. Each time, confusion deepened across his face. The story he had told himself for years no longer made sense. If Claire came from one of the most successful families in American finance, then the assumptions he had repeated during their marriage suddenly looked ridiculous. Yet pride often resisted truth long after truth became obvious. Ethan eventually excused himself from his group and crossed the ballroom. Claire noticed him approaching before he reached her. Sophia noticed too. Do you want me to stay? Sophia asked quietly. Claire offered a small smile. No, it is okay. Sophia squeezed her arm gently before walking away. Ethan stopped several feet from Claire. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the ballroom continued around them. Laughter, conversation, glasses clinking softly. Yet the space between them felt strangely isolated. So, Ethan finally said. Claire waited. You never mentioned him. She looked toward her father. You never asked. Ethan seemed irritated by the answer. That is not fair. Claire almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the irony felt impossible to ignore. Fair, she repeated softly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. You know what I mean. Do I? For the first time, he struggled to find words. During their marriage, Ethan had always been quick with explanations, quick with opinions, quick with judgments. Now uncertainty had replaced certainty. Why would you hide something like that? He asked. Claire studied him quietly. The answer seemed obvious. Because I wanted people to know me before they knew my last name. Ethan looked away. Most people would not do that. I know. A silence settled between them. Through the windows, the first lights of evening began appearing across the Chicago skyline. Claire remembered another conversation years ago, shortly after she and Ethan started dating. He had spent an entire dinner talking about successful families and powerful connections. At the time, she thought he admired achievement. Looking back, she realized he admired access. There was a difference. Ethan cleared his throat. I guess there are things I did not understand. Claire said nothing. The understatement was almost remarkable. Before Ethan could continue, another voice interrupted them. Claire. Richard approached with 2 board members beside him. His expression brightened immediately when he saw her. The change was impossible to miss. The board members noticed it too. One of them smiled knowingly. Richard has spent the entire afternoon talking about you, the woman said warmly. Claire laughed. That sounds dangerous. Richard smiled. Only the good stories. The exchange felt natural, comfortable, familiar. Years of distance remained between them, yet some connections survived even the longest silence. Ethan watched the interaction carefully. Something in his expression shifted. Not jealousy, something closer to realization. He was witnessing a relationship built on affection rather than advantage. A relationship he had never understood because he had never bothered to look beyond the surface. Richard turned toward him politely. Ethan Parker, correct? Ethan immediately straightened. Yes, sir. Richard extended his hand. I have heard you are one of the department leaders. Ethan shook it. I try to do my best. Richard nodded pleasantly. That is all anyone can ask. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet when it ended, Ethan looked strangely unsettled. Perhaps because Richard treated him exactly the same way he treated everyone else. No special attention. No admiration. No interest in status. Just professional courtesy. As the evening continued, Claire noticed something she had not expected. The weight she had carried for years felt lighter. She had spent so much time protecting her identity that she forgot how exhausting secrecy could become. The truth was finally visible. She was still the same woman who arrived early, worked hard, and avoided office politics. The difference was that people could no longer project their assumptions onto an empty space. They now had to confront reality instead. Near the ballroom entrance, Ethan stood alone watching the crowd. For the first time since Claire had known him, he looked uncertain about his place in the room. And somewhere deep inside, he was beginning to understand a painful truth. The woman he once dismissed had never needed his success, his money, or his approval. The real question was whether he had ever deserved hers. The reception finally ended just after 6 o'clock. Employees filtered out of the ballroom in small groups, carrying coffee cups, folders, and conversations that would likely continue for days. The discovery surrounding Claire had become the dominant topic throughout the building. By the time she returned to her desk on the 23rd floor, she could already feel the difference. Nothing had changed, yet everything had changed. People smiled more carefully. Conversations stopped when she approached. A few coworkers who had barely acknowledged her existence for months suddenly seemed eager to introduce themselves. Claire found the entire situation exhausting. She sat down, opened her laptop, and focused on the one thing she could still control: work. Numbers remained numbers regardless of family names. Reports remained reports regardless of office gossip. For nearly an hour, she lost herself in spreadsheets and quarterly projections. The familiar rhythm helped quiet the noise in her head. Then her phone vibrated. One message appeared on the screen. "Dinner tonight? Just us. No board members. No executives. Dad." Claire stared at the words for several seconds. 12 years of silence could not be repaired over a single meal. Yet something about the message felt sincere. No pressure. No expectations. Just an invitation. Before she could overthink it, she typed a simple response. "Yes." Across the office, Ethan stood inside a glass conference room speaking with two senior managers. Claire noticed him only briefly. He looked distracted, less polished than usual. The confidence that once seemed effortless now appeared forced. Several times during the afternoon, she had caught him watching her from a distance. Not with anger, not even with resentment. Mostly confusion, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces no longer fit together. At 7:15, Claire stepped out into the cool Chicago evening. The air carried the scent of rain and lake water. Traffic moved steadily along Michigan Avenue while office towers reflected thousands of lights into the darkening sky. A black sedan waited at the curb. The driver greeted her politely before opening the rear door. Claire almost laughed at the familiarity of it. For years, she had avoided every reminder of the life she came from. Tonight, there seemed no point pretending. 20 minutes later, she entered a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline like a painting. Richard was already there. He stood when he saw her approach. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he smiled. "You came." Claire slid into the seat across from him. "You sound surprised." "Hopeful," he corrected gently. The waiter arrived. Orders were placed. Water glasses filled. Then silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Richard folded his hands. "I owe you an apology." Claire blinked. She had expected many things. Tonight, that was not one of them. Richard continued. "For years I convinced myself I was protecting you. The truth is that I was trying to control the outcome." Claire looked down at the table. Memories surfaced immediately. Arguments. Expectations. Endless conversations about responsibility and legacy. Richard had wanted her involved in the family business. Claire had wanted independence. Neither had been willing to bend. "I was not exactly easy to deal with either," she admitted. Richard smiled softly. "You were my daughter." The words carried no judgment, only affection. They spent the next 2 hours talking. Really talking. About the years they had missed. About mistakes. About careers. About family members. About ordinary things. The conversation flowed more easily than either expected. Somewhere along the way, the distance between them began to shrink. Not disappear, but shrink. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan sat alone in his condominium overlooking Grant Park. The television played quietly in the background, ignored. An untouched glass of water rested beside him. His laptop remained open on the kitchen island displaying quarterly performance reports. Yet he could not focus on any of it. His thoughts kept returning to Claire, to the ballroom, to Richard Bennett, to every conversation they had shared during their marriage. Suddenly memories looked different. There had been signs. Small signs. Claire never cared about luxury brands. Never cared about expensive cars. never cared about networking events. She had never asked about his salary, never pressured him for gifts, never measured people by status. At the time, he interpreted those qualities as a lack of ambition. Now he wondered if they reflected something else entirely. Security, confidence, values he never understood because he had spent so much of his life chasing external validation. Ethan stood and walked toward the window. Chicago stretched before him in a sea of lights. Somewhere in that city, Claire was rebuilding a relationship with the father he had never known existed. The realization left him unexpectedly unsettled. Not because of Richard's wealth. Wealth suddenly seemed irrelevant. What bothered him was something much simpler. He had been married to Claire for 5 years. 5 years. And somehow he had never truly known who she was. Back at the restaurant, dessert plates had long since been cleared away. Richard leaned back in his chair. There is something else we should discuss. Claire raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. Richard laughed. Possibly. Then his expression became thoughtful. I did not come to Parker and Wren by accident. Claire's smile faded slightly. What do you mean? Richard looked out at the river before answering. Let us just say there are reasons I accepted this position beyond business strategy. A small knot tightened in Claire's stomach. She knew that tone. Her father rarely spoke without purpose. Dad, she said slowly. What are you not telling me? Richard's eyes returned to hers. For a brief moment, something unreadable passed across his face. Then he smiled. We will talk about it soon. Claire did not like that answer. Not at all. Because after everything that had happened today, she suddenly had the feeling that the biggest revelation had not happened yet. Claire barely slept that night. Long after returning to her apartment, she found herself standing beside the living room window watching the lights of Chicago shimmer beneath a blanket of clouds. Richard's final words echoed in her mind. There are reasons I accepted this position beyond business strategy. The statement felt simple on the surface, yet something about it refused to leave her alone. Her father had spent decades making decisions with purpose. He never moved pieces on a board without seeing several moves ahead. The question was why Parker and Wren mattered enough for him to become personally involved. By sunrise, the city was wrapped in a light drizzle. Gray skies reflected against steel buildings as commuters flooded sidewalks carrying umbrellas and coffee cups. Claire arrived at the office earlier than usual. The 23rd floor remained quiet except for the distant hum of printers and air conditioning. She appreciated the silence. It gave her a chance to think. Unfortunately, silence rarely lasted long. By 8:30, employees began arriving. Conversations immediately followed her through the office. Some people greeted her warmly. Others appeared cautious. Everyone seemed aware of who she was now. Claire answered politely and continued working. She refused to become distracted by curiosity or gossip. Near mid-morning, an email appeared in every employee's inbox. Mandatory leadership town hall. Attendance required. Conference center. 3 o'clock. The announcement spread through the building instantly. Employees speculated about restructuring plans, executive appointments, and strategic changes. Parker and Wren had entered a new era, and everyone wanted to know where they stood. Around noon, Claire received a separate message. It contained only one sentence. Please stop by my office before the meeting. Dad. Her stomach tightened. At 2:15, she stepped onto the executive floor. Thick carpet softened every footstep. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of Lake Michigan. Assistants moved efficiently between offices lined with glass and polished wood. The environment felt familiar despite the years that separated her from it. Richard's assistant greeted her warmly and opened the door. Inside, Richard stood beside the window reviewing documents. He looked up and smiled. Right on time. Claire crossed the room. You inherited that from me. Richard laughed. I seem to remember saying that first. For a few moments they talked casually. Then Richard's expression grew more serious. He set the folder aside and motioned for her to sit. Claire immediately recognized the shift. Whatever came next mattered. You asked why I accepted this position, he said. Claire nodded. Richard folded his hands. 3 years ago, one of my consulting firms conducted a broad evaluation of financial companies preparing for expansion. Parker and Wren was among them. Claire listened carefully. The company had potential, Richard continued. Strong people, good market position, but there were cultural concerns. What kind of concerns? Richard's gaze remained steady. Leadership issues, internal politics, performance reviews influenced by personal relationships. talented employees being overlooked. Claire felt a strange sensation in her chest. And Richard opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. And one name appeared repeatedly. Claire looked down. Her own name stared back at her from the report. She blinked. What is this? An internal assessment. Richard's voice softened. Independent analysts identified you as one of the strongest operational employees in the company. Claire looked up in surprise. I never told anyone who I was. I know. Then how did you find out? Richard smiled faintly. You forget who taught you how to build a professional reputation. Claire stared at the pages. Performance metrics, efficiency reports, project evaluations. The analysts had praised her work repeatedly, yet her career progression remained unusually stagnant. Richard continued. When I saw your name, I became curious. A pause followed. Then I became concerned. Claire's pulse quickened. She already suspected where this conversation was heading. You investigated. I reviewed the facts. Richard chose his words carefully, and what I found suggested you were not being evaluated fairly. Before Claire could respond, a knock interrupted them. Richard's assistant stepped inside. The board has arrived. Richard nodded. The assistant departed. Silence settled briefly across the office. Then Richard stood. There is something else you should know. Claire rose slowly. What? Richard met her eyes. Today is not only a town hall meeting. A small smile appeared. It is also the first step toward correcting several mistakes. 3 o'clock arrived quickly. Hundreds of employees filled the conference center. Conversations echoed beneath high ceilings and bright lights. Executives occupied the front rows. Managers gathered together. Ethan sat near the center beside senior leadership, reviewing notes on his tablet. He looked confident again, as though the uncertainty of previous days had finally begun to fade. Across the room, Claire entered quietly and took a seat near the back. Few people noticed her arrival. Everyone's attention focused on the stage. Moments later, Richard Bennett stepped to the podium. Applause filled the room. He thanked employees for their hard work and spoke about the company's future. Then his tone shifted. Great organizations succeed when talent is recognized honestly, he said. The room grew quieter. Unfortunately, that has not always happened here. Ethan looked up. Several executives exchanged glances. Richard continued. Over the past several weeks, I have reviewed extensive internal evaluations. He paused. Some findings were deeply concerning. The conference center became completely silent. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Richard's eyes swept across the audience. Calm, controlled, certain. Today, he said, we begin addressing those findings. And somewhere in the room, Ethan Parker felt the first unmistakable hint that the future he expected might not be waiting for him after all. The silence inside the conference center seemed to stretch endlessly after Richard Bennett's announcement. Hundreds of employees sat motionless, waiting for him to continue. Outside the towering windows, rain traced thin silver lines down the glass, blurring the Chicago skyline into soft shapes and muted lights. Inside, every eye remained fixed on the stage. Richard stood calmly behind the podium, completely at ease with the attention. He had spent decades leading companies through uncertainty. A room full of anxious executives did not intimidate him. Over the last several weeks, he continued, my team conducted a thorough review of employee evaluations, departmental performance, promotion histories, and leadership practices. His voice carried evenly through the room. Many employees have performed exceptional work without receiving the recognition they earned. A murmur spread through the audience. Ethan sat perfectly still. He no longer looked relaxed. His fingers rested motionless on the edge of the table. Nearby managers exchanged nervous glances. Nobody knew exactly where the conversation was headed. Richard clicked a remote. A presentation appeared on the massive screen behind him. Charts, performance metrics, department rankings, employee retention numbers. Everything looked objective and precise. Successful companies grow when merit matters more than perception, Richard said. The moment personal narratives become more important than actual results, organizations begin losing talented people. Claire felt a strange tension building in the room. She recognized it immediately. People were starting to wonder whether they were being discussed, whether they had benefited from those narratives, whether they had helped create them. Richard advanced to another slide. One particular case stood out. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat. Richard continued. An employee consistently ranked among the top performers in operational efficiency, project execution, and cross-department collaboration. New charts appeared on the screen. The numbers were impressive, significantly above average. Several executives leaned forward. Claire recognized the data immediately. It was hers. Her stomach tightened. Despite these results, Richard continued, this employee received limited advancement opportunities over several years. The room became noticeably quieter. Ethan's expression began to harden. He seemed to understand exactly where the conversation was heading. Richard stepped away from the podium. I believe talent deserves transparency. Another slide appeared. Claire Bennett. The name filled the screen. A collective gasp moved through the audience. Claire felt heat rise into her cheeks. She hated being the center of attention. Always had. Yet there was no escaping it now. Richard continued speaking. Independent evaluations repeatedly identified Claire Bennett as one of the strongest operational professionals in this company. Employees immediately turned toward her. Some looked surprised. Others looked embarrassed. A few appeared genuinely pleased. Sophia Reynolds smiled proudly from across the room. Richard's voice remained calm. Several recommendations for advancement were submitted over the years. Another slide appeared. Promotion recommendations, leadership endorsements, performance commendations. Claire had never seen most of them. Her heart skipped. She had not known they existed. Richard paused before delivering the next sentence. Most were never acted upon. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over a room when people begin realizing uncomfortable truths. Ethan stared at the screen. His face had lost all color. Richard did not look at him directly. He did not need to. When I reviewed the documentation, Richard said, I found a pattern. Assumptions had replaced evaluation. Perceptions had replaced facts. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The conference center felt frozen. Claire sat motionless. Every year she had convinced herself there must be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she needed more experience. Maybe she needed better timing. Maybe she simply was not ready. Now she was seeing evidence that told a different story. Richard looked toward the audience. This company will not move forward while talented people remain trapped behind outdated assumptions. Applause began slowly. One person, then another, then dozens. Soon the entire room echoed with it. Not forced applause, genuine applause, recognition, respect. Claire felt overwhelmed. She lowered her eyes briefly, trying to process everything happening around her. When she looked up again, she noticed Ethan. Unlike everyone else, he was not clapping. He sat completely still, staring at the screen where her achievements remained displayed. For the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain of himself. Not defensive, not angry, lost. As though the story he had spent years telling had suddenly collapsed beneath him. Richard allowed the applause to fade before speaking again. Effective immediately, we will begin implementing a new leadership review process. More slides appeared. Organizational changes. Revised promotion criteria. Independent oversight. Accountability measures. The audience listened carefully. Yet Claire barely heard any of it. Her thoughts remained fixed on the screen. On the years she spent questioning her own value. On the opportunities she assumed she had not earned. On the confidence she slowly lost while believing other people knew something she did not. Across the room, Ethan finally lowered his gaze. For the first time, he appeared unable to meet hers. And as the meeting continued beneath the glow of conference lights and the distant sound of rain against the windows, realization settled heavily over him. Claire Bennett had never needed anyone to elevate her. She had already done the work. The only thing standing between her and recognition had been the people who refused to see it. When the town hall finally ended, employees remained seated longer than usual. Small groups formed throughout the conference center, their conversations low but animated. The presentation had done more than announce policy changes. It had exposed something many people preferred not to examine: how easily assumptions could become accepted facts. Claire stayed in her seat until most of the crowd began filing toward the exits. She needed a moment to breathe. The room felt different now, not because people knew who her father was. That revelation had already happened. What felt different was that her work had finally been seen. Not through rumors, not through office politics, through evidence, through results, through years of effort that had existed whether anyone acknowledged them or not. There you are. Sophia appeared beside her carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Claire accepted one gratefully. I think half the company wants to talk to you. Claire laughed softly. That sounds terrible. You have no idea. Sophia smiled. The operations team is treating you like a celebrity. Claire shook her head. I just want to finish my projects. That might be impossible now. They walked together toward the elevators. Around them, employees continued discussing the meeting. Some looked inspired. Others looked nervous. Change always created both reactions. As they reached the lobby, Claire noticed Ethan standing alone near one of the marble columns. He seemed lost in thought. For once, he was not surrounded by managers or executives, not delivering confident speeches, not controlling the room, just standing quietly. When his eyes met hers, he hesitated before walking over. Sophia immediately sensed the tension. I should get back upstairs, she said. Claire nodded. After Sophia left, silence settled between them. Ethan glanced toward the revolving doors where rain continued falling outside. Can we talk? He asked. Claire studied him carefully. His voice sounded different, less certain, less rehearsed. For a few minutes, they moved toward a quieter corner of the lobby. The building's evening crowd flowed around them as employees headed home. Ethan slipped his hands into his pockets. I have been thinking a lot these past few days. Claire remained silent. Ethan exhaled slowly. I was wrong about you. The words seemed difficult for him to say, perhaps because they represented something he rarely offered. An admission. Claire looked at him without speaking. He continued. Not just recently. For years. The lobby lights reflected against polished stone floors. Outside, headlights glowed through the rain. Ethan shook his head. I convinced myself I understood who you were. A bitter smile crossed his face. Turns out I understood almost nothing. Claire listened quietly. There was a time when hearing those words would have meant everything to her. Back when she spent sleepless nights trying to defend herself against accusations that never should have existed. Back when she believed understanding could save a relationship. That time had passed. Why are you telling me this now? She asked gently. Ethan laughed once, humorlessly. Because for the first time I am looking at the truth instead of the story I wanted to believe. His eyes lowered briefly. And because I owe you an apology. Claire felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Just sadness. Sadness for two people who had spent years misunderstanding each other. Ethan continued. You know what bothers me the most? He looked up again. Not that you are Richard Bennett's daughter. Claire waited. It is realizing that none of it mattered. Rain tapped softly against the lobby windows. Ethan's voice grew quieter. You were the same person before anyone knew. The same person doing the work. The same person showing up every day. He shook his head. I just never saw it. Claire felt her grip tighten slightly around the coffee cup. There was honesty in his words. More honesty than she had heard from him in years. Yet honesty arriving late still carried consequences. You saw what you wanted to see, she said softly. Ethan nodded. I know. Another silence followed. This one felt less uncomfortable. More final. Eventually Claire offered a small smile. Not because everything was forgiven. Not because the past disappeared. Simply because she no longer wanted to carry its weight. Take care of yourself, Ethan. The words were kind. But they were also a goodbye. Ethan seemed to understand immediately. He nodded once. You too, Claire. Then he walked away. Claire watched him disappear into the crowd beyond the revolving doors. The strange thing was that she felt lighter afterward. Not because he apologized. Not because he finally understood. Because she no longer needed him to. Her worth had never depended on his opinion. Outside, the rain had begun to slow. Claire stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up at the towering skyline. Somewhere above, office lights still glowed against the darkening sky. Her phone vibrated. A new message from Richard appeared. Board meeting tomorrow morning. We need to discuss your future. Claire stared at the words. A cool breeze moved through the city streets. Tomorrow. Something told her that another chapter was about to begin. And unlike every chapter before it, this one would not be written by anyone else's assumptions. The next morning arrived clear and bright, as if the storm that had hovered over Chicago for days had finally moved on. Sunlight spilled across the glass towers downtown, turning the city into a landscape of silver reflections and sharp edges. Claire stood in front of her apartment window with a cup of coffee warming her hands. Richard's message from the night before lingered in her thoughts. We need to discuss your future. The words carried weight, not because of who he was, but because of what they suggested. For years, Claire had focused on surviving one day at a time. building a quiet life, doing good work, keeping her head down. She had never planned beyond that. Now, for the first time in a long while, the future felt uncertain in a different way. Not threatening. Possible. By 8:45, she stepped onto the executive floor once again. Employees greeted her differently now. Some smiled warmly. Others offered respectful nods. Nobody treated her like an invisible employee anymore. Yet Claire noticed something important. The attention felt temporary. Curiosity always faded eventually. What remained afterward would be substance, character, results. Those were the things she trusted. Richard's assistant escorted her into the boardroom overlooking Lake Michigan. Morning sunlight flooded the space through towering windows. The polished walnut table stretched nearly 30 feet from end to end. Several board members were already present. Claire recognized a few faces from the reception and town hall. They greeted her politely. Richard entered moments later carrying a folder. He looked relaxed, confident, completely at home. "Thank you all for coming," he said. Everyone took their seats. Claire remained uncertain why she was there. Richard opened the folder and distributed several documents. "Over the past month," he began, "we completed a comprehensive leadership review." Several board members nodded. They had clearly discussed this before. Richard continued. "Part of that review involved identifying individuals capable of supporting long-term operational transformation." Claire felt a quiet warning signal somewhere in the back of her mind. Richard turned a page. One name consistently appeared at the top of every independent evaluation. The room remained silent. Richard looked directly at her. "Claire Bennett." She immediately shook her head. "Dad." A few board members smiled. Richard ignored the interruption. "The data is overwhelming." He slid a report toward her. Claire scanned the pages. Leadership potential assessments, strategic planning reviews, performance analyses. Every page seemed to tell the same story. Richard folded his hands. "The board has approved the creation of a new position." Claire looked up. "What position?" One of the directors answered before Richard could. "Vice President of Operational Strategy." The room suddenly felt smaller. Claire stared at them. "You cannot be serious." Richard smiled. "Actually, we are completely serious. I have never held an executive title." Another director spoke. "You have been performing executive-level work for years." Claire opened her mouth, then closed it again. She did not know how to respond. Richard leaned forward slightly. "This is not charity." His voice was gentle but firm. "It is recognition." The distinction mattered deeply. For years, Claire had worked to avoid being handed opportunities because of her last name. The thought of accepting this position terrified her. Yet the reports sitting in front of her told a different story. Independent analysts, performance metrics, results. None of them had known she was Richard Bennett's daughter when they wrote those evaluations. The recommendation existed because of her work, not her family. The realization settled quietly inside her. Around the table, board members waited patiently. Finally, Claire exhaled. "I need time to think." Richard smiled. "Good." She blinked. "Good. Anyone who accepts major responsibility without thinking first worries me." Laughter moved gently around the room. The tension eased. The meeting continued for another hour. Strategic discussions, future initiatives, organizational goals. Yet Claire's thoughts kept returning to the same question. What if she was capable of more than she allowed herself to believe? When the meeting finally ended, she stepped into the hallway feeling overwhelmed. The executive floor buzzed with normal activity around her. Phones rang. Assistants moved between offices. Meetings began and ended. Life continued. Yet something inside her had shifted. As she walked toward the elevators, she noticed Ethan standing near a conference room doorway. He looked surprised to see her emerging from the boardroom. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan glanced toward the closed doors behind her. Understanding slowly appeared in his expression. Not the complete picture, just enough. He offered a faint smile. "Looks like things are changing." Claire considered the statement. Then she smiled politely. "They already have." The elevator doors opened beside her. She stepped inside and turned back toward the hallway. Ethan remained standing exactly where she had left him, watching the doors close. As the elevator descended toward the lower floors, Claire felt something she had not experienced in years. Not vindication, not revenge, possibility. And sometimes possibility was far more powerful. The following week passed in a blur of meetings, reports, and difficult decisions. Claire spent more time on the executive floor than she ever imagined possible. Every day seemed to introduce another conversation about leadership, strategy, or the future of Parker and Wren. Yet despite the growing responsibilities, she still approached her work the same way she always had. One task at a time, one problem at a time, one solution at a time. The title being discussed around boardroom tables had not changed who she was. If anything, it reminded her of the importance of staying grounded. On a bright Thursday afternoon, sunlight streamed through the glass walls of the headquarters, filling the building with a warm, golden glow. Chicago stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Boats moved across Lake Michigan. Traffic flowed through downtown streets nearly 23 stories below. Claire stood in her office reviewing operational projections when a knock sounded at the door. Sophia stepped inside carrying a folder. "You have become very difficult to schedule," she teased. Claire laughed. "I am still getting used to all of this." Sophia placed the folder on the desk. "Everyone is." Her smile softened. "You know people are rooting for you." Claire looked down at the reports. For years she had worked quietly, unnoticed by most of the company. The support still felt strange. "Thank you," she said sincerely. After Sophia left, Claire returned to her work. A few minutes later, her email notification chimed. Company-wide announcement. Mandatory attendance requested. Executive reception tonight. Main ballroom. 7 o'clock. Claire opened the message. Richard had scheduled a formal evening event for senior leadership, department heads, and selected employees. The purpose appeared simple enough. Introduce the next phase of organizational changes. Yet something about the wording caught her attention. Several major announcements regarding future leadership structure. Claire leaned back slowly. Her father rarely did anything without careful planning. Whatever happened tonight would matter. By evening, the ballroom had been transformed. Chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors. Round tables draped in white linen filled the room. Soft music drifted through the air while employees gathered in groups. Men wore tailored suits. Women wore elegant dresses and business attire. The atmosphere felt sophisticated without being excessive. Claire arrived wearing a navy dress and a simple silver bracelet. She preferred understated elegance. Always had. As she entered the ballroom, conversations briefly quieted before resuming. People smiled. Some waved. Others approached to say hello. The difference from a few weeks earlier was impossible to ignore. Yet Claire remained careful not to let it affect her. Respect earned through visibility could disappear quickly. Respect earned through character lasted longer. Near the front of the room, Richard spoke with board members and investors. When he noticed Claire, his expression brightened immediately. Several people around him noticed that too. Across the ballroom, Ethan stood near a group of department leaders. He looked composed, professional, and noticeably quieter than before. The weeks following the town hall had changed him. Not dramatically, but enough. The arrogance that once seemed permanent had faded around the edges. Claire noticed him watching the room rather than dominating it. Listening more than speaking. Reflection had a way of humbling people. At precisely 7:30, Richard stepped onto the stage. The ballroom gradually fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. He thanked employees for their dedication and spoke about the company's future. Growth, innovation, accountability, opportunity. Themes that had become increasingly familiar under his leadership. Then he paused. The room grew still. Richard smiled slightly. "There is one final matter I would like to address tonight." A large screen illuminated behind him. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Claire felt an unexpected knot tighten in her stomach. Richard continued. "Over the past several months, I have spoken extensively about recognizing talent. The screen displayed performance data, leadership assessments, strategic evaluations, familiar documents. Claire immediately recognized them. Around the ballroom, people leaned forward attentively. Richard's voice remained calm. Organizations thrive when capable people are empowered to lead. Another slide appeared. This one displayed a single photograph. Claire's photograph. A collective murmur swept through the room. Her heartbeat stumbled. Richard looked directly at the audience. After careful review and unanimous board approval, I am pleased to announce the appointment of our new Vice President of Operational Strategy. The room became completely silent. Claire felt every eye turned toward her. Richard smiled. Proudly, openly, like a father who no longer intended to hide how much he believed in his daughter. Claire Bennett. For a moment, She could not move. Applause erupted across the ballroom. Then it grew louder and louder. Employees stood. Executives stood. Even board members rose from their seats. The sound filled every corner of the room. Claire remained frozen as emotion surged unexpectedly through her chest. Not because of the title, not because of the promotion, because after years of being underestimated, questioned, and misunderstood, the truth was finally standing in the light where everyone could see it. Across the ballroom, Ethan joined the applause. He did not look resentful. He did not look angry. He looked thoughtful, almost relieved, as though the outcome finally made sense. Claire slowly rose from her seat. The applause continued. Richard extended his hand toward the stage. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire stepped forward without wondering whether she belonged there. The applause seemed endless. Claire walked toward the stage through a sea of smiling faces, the sound echoing beneath crystal chandeliers and across polished marble floors. Every step felt unreal. For years she had entered rooms quietly, avoiding attention whenever possible. Now hundreds of people were standing in recognition of work she never expected anyone to notice. When she reached the stage, Richard greeted her with a proud smile and a brief embrace. It was simple, genuine, the kind of moment neither of them would have imagined possible a few months earlier. The ballroom gradually settled as the applause faded. Claire accepted the microphone carefully. Public speaking had never frightened her. What frightened her was saying something that mattered. She looked across the room. Executives, analysts, assistants, managers, employees from every department. People who had known her story. People who had misunderstood it. People who had never known it at all. "Thank you," she began. Her voice carried clearly through the ballroom. "I am honored by the trust being placed in me." The room remained completely silent. Claire smiled softly. "The truth is that I never expected this moment." A few people laughed quietly. She continued, "Not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed good work should speak for itself." Several heads nodded. Sometimes it takes longer than we want. Sometimes it feels invisible, but that does not make it less valuable. The words felt personal because they were. Claire thanked her colleagues. Thanked the team she had worked beside. Thanked the people who had supported her even when recognition never arrived. Then she handed the microphone back to Richard. The audience responded with another wave of applause. Yet what stayed with Claire was not the title. It was the feeling of finally standing in front of the truth. Later that evening, the formal program ended and the ballroom transformed into a celebration. Conversations filled the air. Glasses clinked softly. Music drifted through the room. Claire moved from group to group accepting congratulations. She remained gracious, though part of her still felt overwhelmed by the attention. Near one of the large windows overlooking the city, Sophia found her. "Vice President Bennett." Claire groaned immediately. Sophia laughed. "I am never getting tired of saying that." Claire shook her head. "Please do not start." "Too late." They both laughed. The skyline beyond the glass glittered beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights stretched across Chicago like stars scattered across the earth. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then Claire noticed movement near the edge of the ballroom. Ethan was approaching. His expression was calm, serious, not the confident mask she remembered from years before. Sophia quietly excused herself and disappeared into the crowd. Ethan stopped a few feet away. "Congratulations." Claire studied him for a moment before smiling politely. "Thank you." He nodded. "You earned it." There was no bitterness in his voice. No sarcasm. Just honesty. The sincerity surprised her. Ethan glanced toward the stage where Richard was speaking with board members. "You know, a year ago, I would have thought tonight was about connections." Claire remained silent. Ethan looked down briefly. "Now I understand it was about work." He smiled faintly. "A lot of work." The admission carried weight because it cost him something. Pride. Ego. Assumptions. Claire could see all of it. "People grow," she said quietly. Ethan laughed once. "Apparently some of us needed more time than others." The city lights reflected in the window beside them. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan took a slow breath. "There is one thing I never understood." Claire raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" He looked directly at her. "Why you stayed as long as you did." The question lingered between them. Claire thought about it carefully. Years earlier, she might have answered differently. She might have talked about hope, about commitment, about trying to save something she believed mattered. Now her answer felt simpler. Because I believe people could become better versions of themselves. Ethan absorbed the words quietly. And now? Claire smiled gently. Now I still believe that. For the first time all evening, Ethan smiled back. A real smile. Small but genuine. Then he nodded once and stepped away. No dramatic ending. No argument. No attempt to rewrite history. Just acceptance. Claire watched him disappear into the crowd. Strange as it seemed, she felt grateful for that. Some chapters did not need revenge. They only needed closure. Near midnight, the ballroom had begun to empty. Employees gathered their coats and said their goodbyes. Richard eventually joined Claire near the entrance. Together they looked across the room where staff members were clearing tables and dimming lights. Quite a night, he said. Claire laughed softly. That is one way to describe it. Richard smiled. Then his expression became thoughtful. You know, there's one thing I never told you. Claire looked at him. What is that? Richard glanced back toward the now empty stage. When I first reviewed the reports about you, I was proud. He paused. But that was not what convinced me to come here. Claire frowned slightly. Then what did? Richard's eyes softened. I wanted to see whether the woman who walked away 12 years ago had become the person she hoped to be. The answer caught her completely off guard. Richard smiled. She did. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the night sky. Inside, the final lights of the ballroom reflected across polished floors. Claire stood quietly beside her father and realized something important. The promotion was never the real victory. Neither was the recognition. The real victory was becoming someone whose value existed long before anyone else noticed it. And that was something no title could ever create or take away. The weeks that followed brought a steady rhythm to Claire's new life. The excitement surrounding her promotion gradually settled into something more meaningful. Responsibility. Every morning she arrived before most employees. Every evening she left with pages of notes, plans, and ideas for improving the company she had quietly helped build for years. The difference now was that people listened when she spoke. Not because of her last name. Not because of her title. Because they had seen the results. Autumn slowly arrived in Chicago. The trees along the river turned shades of gold and amber. Crisp air swept through downtown streets. Sunlight reflected off glass towers beneath cloudless skies. Inside Parker and Wren, change continued. Departments collaborated more effectively. Employee satisfaction improved. Projects that had stalled for years finally moved forward. The culture Richard envisioned was beginning to take shape. One Friday afternoon, Claire stood inside a conference room overlooking Lake Michigan reviewing quarterly reports with a team of managers. The meeting ended with laughter rather than tension. A small thing, yet important. As the managers gathered their materials, one of them paused beside her. I wanted to say thank you. Claire looked surprised. For what? The woman smiled. For proving that good leadership does not need to be loud. After she left, Claire remained by the window for a moment. The comment stayed with her. For years, she had assumed strength required constant visibility, constant recognition. Yet some of the strongest people she had ever known worked quietly, consistently, without demanding attention. Her father had taught her that. Life had confirmed it. Later that afternoon, Richard invited her to join him for coffee in his office. The executive suite felt less intimidating now, familiar rather than distant, comfortable rather than overwhelming. Richard stood near the window as she entered. The city stretched behind him beneath clear blue skies. You look tired, he said. Claire laughed. That sounds suspiciously like a compliment. It is. Richard handed her a cup of coffee. People who care about their work usually look tired. They settled into chairs near the window. For several minutes they talked about ordinary things. Family, business, weekend plans. The simplicity of the conversation felt valuable. Neither of them needed to force their relationship anymore. It was growing naturally, slowly, honestly. Eventually Richard set his coffee aside. There is something I have been meaning to tell you. Claire smiled. Every time you say that, my life changes. Richard laughed. Hopefully not this time. He became thoughtful. Do you remember the first time you told me you wanted to succeed on your own? Claire nodded immediately. She remembered the argument vividly. The frustration, the stubbornness, the certainty that nobody understood her. Richard looked toward the skyline. At the time, I thought you were making a mistake. Claire raised an eyebrow. You made that very clear. He smiled. Yes, I did. A silence followed. Then Richard continued. I realize now that I was wrong. Claire stared at him. Richard rarely admitted mistakes. You needed to build your own life, he said. Quietly. Not the one I imagined for you. The words landed softly, yet carried enormous weight. For years both of them had carried regrets about the choices that separated them. Hearing those regrets acknowledged felt unexpectedly healing. Claire smiled. I was not exactly easy either. No, Richard agreed. You definitely were not. They both laughed. Outside, sunlight danced across the surface of Lake Michigan. Boats moved slowly across the water. The city felt peaceful, stable, certain, something Claire had not felt in a long time. As evening approached, she returned to her office to finish several reports. The floor had mostly emptied. Soft light from desk lamps reflected against glass walls. The building seemed quieter than usual. Claire gathered her things and prepared to leave. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed Ethan standing near the elevators. He looked surprised to see her. Working late? He asked. Some habits never change. He smiled faintly. That is probably why you are where you are. Claire laughed softly. The old version of Ethan would never have said something like that. They stepped into the elevator together. During the descent, neither felt the need to fill the silence. There was something peaceful about that. When the doors opened in the lobby, Ethan paused before leaving. You know, he said, I spent years believing success meant getting people to admire you. Claire listened quietly. Ethan looked toward the revolving doors where evening traffic flowed through downtown Chicago. Now I think it means becoming someone you admire yourself. Claire considered the statement. Then she nodded. That sounds closer to the truth. Ethan smiled and disappeared into the crowd outside. Claire watched him go. Not with sadness. Not with resentment. Simply with understanding. People changed when they chose to learn from their mistakes. Some learned early. Others learned late. What mattered was learning it all. As she stepped onto the sidewalk beneath the glow of city lights, a cool breeze moved through the streets. Cars passed. Pedestrians hurried home. Somewhere above, office windows reflected the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Claire paused for a moment and looked back at the building behind her. Months earlier she had entered those doors carrying doubts she never spoke aloud. Doubts about her worth, her future, her place in the world. Now those doubts felt distant. Not because someone rescued her. Not because someone handed her success. Because she finally saw herself clearly. And sometimes the greatest form of justice was not proving others wrong. It was no longer needing their permission to believe you were right. Winter arrived quietly in Chicago. The first snow of the season dusted rooftops and sidewalks in a thin layer of white, softening the sharp edges of the city. From the windows of Parker and Wren Financial, the skyline looked almost peaceful beneath the pale December sky. Nearly 6 months had passed since the evening that changed everything. 6 months since a crowded ballroom watched Claire Bennett step into the recognition she had earned long before anyone noticed it. The company had changed. The people inside it had changed. And perhaps most importantly, Claire had changed too. Not in the dramatic way people often imagine success would change someone. She still arrived early. Still preferred listening before speaking. Still carried her own coffee from the lobby cafe instead of sending someone else to get it. The difference was quieter than that. She trusted herself now. On the final Friday before the holiday break, employees gathered in the main atrium for the annual company celebration. Strings of white lights wrapped around towering trees. Music drifted through the lobby. Laughter echoed between marble walls and glass elevators. People exchanged gifts, shared stories, and prepared to spend time with their families. Claire stood near one of the windows watching snowflakes drift beyond the glass. In her hands rested a small ornament decorated with the company logo. One of the interns had given it to her earlier that morning. The gesture was simple, yet somehow it meant more than expensive gifts ever could. You always find the quietest corner in the room. Richard's voice appeared beside her. Claire smiled. Someone has to. He laughed softly. The months had been good for both of them. The distance that once separated father and daughter had faded into something stronger. Not perfection, not a fairy tale. Something real, built through time, honesty, and effort. Richard handed her a cup of coffee. I have something for you. Claire immediately looked suspicious. Should I be worried? Probably. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. Claire opened it carefully. Her eyes widened. It was a photograph. An old one. Taken nearly 15 years earlier. A younger Claire stood beside her father on a dock overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Both were smiling. Both looked completely certain life would always remain simple. Claire stared at the picture for several seconds. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in her chest. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. Richard smiled. "I have had it the entire time." Snow continued falling outside, while voices and laughter filled the atrium behind them. Claire looked back at the photograph. For years, she had believed she lost more than a relationship with her father. She believed she had lost parts of herself. Looking at the image now, she realized something important. Those parts had never disappeared. They were simply waiting to be rediscovered. Across the room, she noticed Ethan speaking with several employees. He looked different than the man she once married. Not because of his appearance, because of his posture, his attitude, his presence. There was less performance in him now, less need to impress. He happened to glance in her direction and offered a small wave. Claire returned it. Nothing more, nothing less. The simplicity felt right. Some stories ended with dramatic confrontations. Others ended with understanding. The company's celebration continued throughout the afternoon. Employees shared memories from the year. Teams reflected on challenges they had overcome. New friendships formed. Old assumptions disappeared. At one point, Sophia climbed onto a chair and delivered an enthusiastic speech that made half the room laugh and the other half groan affectionately. Claire found herself smiling more than she had in years. Not because life had become perfect, because she finally understood that happiness was never waiting somewhere in the future. It existed in moments like these. Near sunset, the gathering began to wind down. Employees collected coats and prepared to leave. The winter sky outside glowed with shades of gold and blue. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the fading light. Claire stood near the entrance, watching people say their goodbyes. Richard joined her one final time. Neither spoke immediately. They simply watched the scene unfold. Then Richard smiled. "Do you know what I think is funny?" Claire glanced at him. "That usually means trouble. The entire company spent months talking about your last name." He shook his head. "When the truth is that your name was never the impressive part." Claire laughed softly. "And what was?" Richard looked at her with quiet pride. "The woman who carried it." For a moment, the world seemed to slow. The snowfall, the city lights, the conversations fading into the background. Claire looked out through the glass doors at the streets beyond. Months earlier, she had walked into this building carrying invisible wounds. Doubts she never spoke aloud. Questions about her worth she was afraid to ask. She had spent years trying to prove something. To Ethan, to her father, to the world. Standing there now, she realized she no longer needed to. The greatest victory was never becoming someone powerful. It was remembering who she was before anyone tried to convince her she was not enough. Outside, the first evening lights flickered on across Chicago. Inside, warmth and laughter lingered in the air. Claire slipped the old photograph into her purse and stepped toward the door. A new year waited beyond it. New challenges, new opportunities, new chapters. But this time she walked forward without fear. Because the woman entering that future did not need revenge. She had already found something far more valuable: peace.